welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Stephen Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is contraception murder? Tim.
There are three things I'd like to do with this episode. One, reevaluate one's position on abortion. Two, reevaluate one's position on murder. Or three, of course, reevaluate one's position on contraception, which is the title of this episode here. The pro-life movement likes to use the word murder to describe abortion, and I'm just going to try to expand it back into time, so to speak, to the state of contraception and the issues surrounding contraception. The pro-life movement likes to argue, and I think they're, at times, you could say they're using idiosyncratic usage of the word murder, that abortion is murder. And I think they've made a persuasive case that, late-term abortion is basically as if murder. And people like Peter Singer, who are probably more logically consistent than a lot of the pro-choice people, would go full infanticide and just argue that infanticide is also murder. If abortion is fine, then infanticide is also fine. So in order to do this, I try to start from the top and then work backwards. I'm going to start with the classic case of murder. If Whoopi Goldberg has the claim rape, I think we have murder, and then murder. So the murder is killing, number 5, killing an independent adult of the protected or the main class who is innocent enough. Again, I'm not talking about slaves. I'm not talking about serfs. I'm not talking about assassination. I'm not talking about self-defense. I'm not talking about the death penalty either. What I'm talking about is just a sort of classic vanilla case of going after a productive, established adult and just in cold blood killing him for whatever reason. Who seems innocent enough. Again, you get into Calvinist, Augustinian things about guilt and so forth. Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie, Blood Diamonds, everyone's guilty. Maybe that's the case. But, in this case, it seems like, if this person dies, the world's worse off because, he probably has people dependent on him. So now the question is killing killing a child or dependent or letting them die, like this case this clear-cut case? Well, I'd say there's a lot of similarities between the two. If I kill a 10-year-old child, you could see him potentially becoming a productive, established adult, or that seems reasonable here. If I kill a 5-year-old child, again, the potential is still there for them to become a productive, established, independent adult. Now we're going to get into letting them die versus killing them is a key difference. If I drove you out in the deserts with them and just kicked you out of the car, let's say it's on a hot night with no food, I think there'd be basically as if murder. It's not quite murder. If I took you up in a plane, or if I knew how to fly and I just, said, I'm just going to fall asleep here, I'd say I'd taken on a positive obligation to take care of you in this plane when I took off. And again, maybe if I get a heart attack and I happen to die, that's not murder. That's more like, but Hammurabi's code, if you build a house and the house falls apart and you had some role in insufficiently building the house, that is sort of like murder here. Now, what's this long aside about letting versus die and positive obligations versus murder? Well, I'm going to move up the scales here. So, is abortion murder? I'm talking about that fetus or the globule cells or that potential person inside the womb. And again, this goes to my opening comments about the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement likes to argue that's murder. So is that analogous with number 5? I have a number of them things here in my own document, my own notes here. And is that analogous with killing that independent adult? Well, I'd say, in the same sense that a child could potentially become a adult, the fetus in the womb could potentially become an adult. And the pro-life movement, I think, to be consistent, and some people are critical of this when politicians say that, should the mother get the death penalty if she kills her child? Well, if she takes a pillow to her infant, we think that's murder. If you take a pillow to a 5-year-old, we think that's murder. If you take the pillow to a 25-year-old adult, we think that's murder. So I think the next logical question to ask, if you're going to say that abortion is murder, whatever punishment you give to that murder, whether it be the death penalty, again, you could take the punishment abolition position, which just basically states that, murder might be a morally heinous, but here on Earth we don't punish people for murder. Again, we've done episodes on the death penalty. We've done an episode on the punishment theory. I'm not here to flesh out that. But I think to be consistent, whatever punishment, if you think it's an analogous thing, killing an adult 25-year-old, 35-year-old male, female, whatever, not slaves, not mentally handicapped people, not self-defense. I just want to clarify what it isn't. And not wars either. If you think it's an analogous thing, then you have to give the same analogous punishment. So I think the next question, and I think this is a reductio ad absurdum, some people would accuse me, but I think it's logical, and I don't think this gets much discussed. I think it's somewhat strategic by some people for not discussing it. Although the Catholics know it's dodgy and for years have known it's dodgy. And the early church, again, the early church did not have access to the contraception we do today. But if you ask someone like Augustine, he seems to argue that contraception is murder, or at least it appears it. You make your, I'm quoting Augustine here, you Manichaeans make your auditors adulterers of their wives when they take care lest the women with whom they copulate conceive. They take wives according to the laws of matrimony by tablets announcing that marriage is contracted to procreate children. And then, fearing because of your law, they copopulate in shameful union only to satisfy lust for their wives. They're unwilling to have children on whose account alone marriages are made. How is it then are not those prohibiting marriage as the apostle predicted of you so long ago when you try to take marriage from what marriage is? When this is taken away, husbands are shameful lovers, wives are harlots, bridal shamers are brothels, father-in-laws are pimps. Wow. I mean, again, I don't know how that's Augustine there. So contraception, again, effective contraceptions and modern technology. Historical contraceptions are dodgy. Again, the pulling out method as described is viewed somewhat shamefully. And again, that requires some amount of experience too. Is contraception, i.e. preventing a child, a kind of murder here, or is this just the wrong use of word here? Is it a less ideal scenario at minimum here? Again, the Catholic Church seems to argue that natural family planning is seemingly okay, but is it the ideal here? Again, so you might not want to say it's murder, but it seems at least to be murder analogous. And then if you think contraception is okay, why not think abortion is also okay? Now you could say, well, this is a distinction here. So I'm going to use an example of a table. We know how to make tables. We're not savages. We're not like those Senegalese here who might not know the uses of this table or this advanced technology here. If you make a table, okay, and right before it goes out the workshop, you destroy it. Versus if you purposely sabotage an early piece of the beginning of the table, make the table, but then when the table, like at some point when the table is trying to form, it just falls apart, and you're just making the table, you're just practicing making the table. What really is the difference? The table doesn't get formed. You're still doing through all the process of it. One table maker will just destroy the table. He'll use all the correct methods. The other table maker will make the nails, use fake nails or something like that. That to me is the difference between abortion and contraception. Now again, my position is the extreme position, but one of the things I think is interesting here is people don't seem to, the pro-life movement is somewhat morally compromised, unless you're speaking of like the Quiverful movement or the Amish or like Catholics who only use natural family planning. Because it does, unlike the traditional pro-life movement, which, again, they're not even sure if abortion is murder if they want to give the punishment. They get annoyed when people start logically. Trump said that, and people get, Christian women get annoyed when Trump said that, but it's the logical position if you think it's the same thing. So it's within here. I've made a case here that I think contraception, if you think abortion is murder, again, you could go into usage of words type debates here. But if you make it the usage of words, then it's like a different type of crime or a different type of, we'll say, misdemeanor here. It's like the difference between letting die or ceasing to form. But it seems like you have to evaluate the other things then if you're going to make that claim. So that's my opening marks here. I brought in Augustine, some early Christians. What was the logic of the case? What do you make of my case? Like, again, I don't have a skin in the game in this case. It's somewhat a hypothetical imperative, as the Randians would say. We live in a world where abortion, if you just want to ask the state ruling courts, most state ruling courts think abortion is a health procedure. So, like, this is just what the law is. I mean, if you don't like the reductio absurdum, you should then appreciate the fact that the law allows other things too. Well, so then what do you make in my case? Is at least analogous here. Swithin?
I don't think so. And also just a note with the law is schizophrenic on this issue, because if I shoot dead a pregnant woman, I'll be tried for double homicide. So, although depending where, I don't know which trimester would count. Probably not the first, but maybe the second. Definitely, I'd be high surprised if it's not the third. It could be the second. I'm not sure. So the law is schizophrenic on the matter. Your point with respect to what something can develop into is an interesting one, but I think one needs to distinguish what you could refer to as inbuilt directedness as a unified substance, and someone acting on the outside to make it happen. So to be sort of like a person, Boethius defines it as an individual substance with a rational nature, something like that. I may have butchered that slightly. No, rational nature, yeah. And so the question arises, is when does the individual substance, which is rational, begin? And it seems pretty clear from biology that when the zygote is formed, there's an individual nucleus which directs the development of the human organism, which is categorically different from sperm and eggs, because they don't have that sort of in themselves the directedness to mature into an adult human. Now, they have a directedness to create one, you could argue, and that would be true, but it's not an individual substance at that point. It's kind of two separate ones as part of a man and a woman. So it's not actually another substance as such. You haven't got a new unified sort of organism which can sort of direct its own development. That's not to say that you don't need out the uterine function or whatever to send hormones and help the development of the human organism, but that once you have the nucleus and the cell DNA, it has this sort of, it exhibits this inbuilt directedness that it otherwise to develop into a mature human, which it doesn't have as separate sperm and egg. So on that basis, I do not think it is preventing conception is the same as murdering. And the Catholics would agree with that as well. But they would then argue that, I was thinking about the natural end, as it were, what sperm and eggs are directed to. So they would make the classic, well, at least Ed Feser would, John Scalco, others. Interesting, a Protestant who's a natural law sort of theorist, Timothy Thiau, I think is what pronounce his name, would make the argument that what you're doing, or versions of this, Scalco's is a bit different, but I'm not familiar with his as much, is that in contraception, what you're doing is you're using the sex organs, but deliberately frustrating their goal, and therefore is kind of immoral in that basis, because you are. Scalco makes the analogy to lying, actually, which is maybe not what you might think you refer to here. But Scalco would make the claim that you are using your speech, which is just what it is to, at least in part, to disclose, to make sort of rational argument and disclose the contents of one's mind. And then if you deliberately lie, you are working contrary to the goal of speech, and therefore is immoral. And so the same thing would apply to contraception. Although, as you noted, natural family planning is okay because, well, according to the Catholic position, because, well, you're not deliberately frustrating, you're doing it as it is intended biologically. It's just that it won't result in conception, which then I think creates a difficulty for them, because if in principle you knew when your wife was not fertile and there was 0% chance of conception, in principle you could engage in natural family planning and have 0 children, which is a position they would not like, and but they may have other independent grounds for arguing against it. But focusing narrowly on that, I think you could say misses the point and the problem when it comes to contraception. As my response to sort of Scalco and Xiao, so they make the claim that sex organs are clearly directed to procreation. They would recognize that sex has sort of like a unitive function. This is classically recognized, that it sort of brings husband and wife together. In some sense, you could say it completes both of them. But they say this, in a sense, is parasitic, although that's probably unfair, but logically dependent on the procreative function. They can't work independently. And as well, Xiao, etc., would also say, if you accept contraception, then the evangelical Protestants who are pro-contraception have no, in principle, argument against homosexuality, because, well, okay, isn't gay sex just unitive in the same way that heterosexual sex is? So they would push there as well as another way you could go. So I was thinking about this and I'm thinking, well, there's what you could make the case for, and this is why deliberately non-procreative sex isn't necessarily against the goal of sexual interaction, is that you could kind of make an idea that there's kind of like the psychological unitive function, which is the one that everyone tends to talk about, but then there's also what you could refer to as the biological unitive function. That is, nature intends that babies are born, but the goal isn't just that babies are born, but that babies survive. And with humans, babies require a lot of resources. And to get those resources, you basically need the parents, in most cases, in the absence of state, to be together so that the resources can be provided for the child so they can survive. During sex, oxytocin is released, which binds the partners together. So there was a study which is cited in Psychology Today, which stated that basically the more sexual contact you have with one person, like a wife or husband or whatever, you have a higher level of oxytocin, which reduces the probability of having sex with somebody else. And now the reason why that might be useful is, of course, if you only have one set of children with one woman, then you're more likely as a husband to devote your resources to them, and so the child will survive. So I think you can make the case that yes, the sex organs are clearly directed towards producing children, but they're also directed towards bringing husband and wife together, not necessarily for their own psychological well-being, but for the child's well-being. And so on that basis, you could make the claim that non-procreative sex isn't contrary to the function of sex. It's merely realizing what another one, and it's not one that's just imposed there by the mind, or it's just psychologically fulfilling. The goal is that it is, in a sense, biologically unitive, so that the biological parents stay together and so that the child survives. And then ultimately reproduces himself, because that's what you could reasonably claim the goal of biological reproduction is, to perpetually reproduce. So I think that whilst in a way it looks, I can see why one would think contraception is dodgy. I think in the context of attempting to have many children, contraception on certain occasions doesn't seem unreasonable. But it isn't as straightforward as some sort of evangelical Protestants would make out, I would say.
My initial comment back would just say is that then abortion isn't is abortion is just abortion just seems to be like a form of, and this is where things get verboten, is people like Margaret Sanger or Richard Spencer to make the case that abortion is just a form of like low impulse control family planning at the end of the near the end of the thing, where people don't really view that they want to raise. Again, there are Satanists who want to have abortions, and there's also organ harvesters. Alex Jones will talk about this. Other people will talk about this, and so forth. I'm well aware to have children just so they have the thrill of killing them. But a lot of it just seems like it's just sort of like ersatz family planning. So then it's like, well, if so I guess a good question is, what would be the ideal number of children you have? Well, it doesn't seem like you can have anything more than 25 per couple if you're assuming monogamy. Because let's say you start when you're 17 or 16, and when you're 41 per year, it seems like 25 would be probably the rough max for one couple here. I'm not talking about polygamy or something like that, but it's just so we did an episode, Are Children Overrated? And I would just make the case that, yeah, at some point, children are overrated. Now, again, there's a certain line of humanism, and again, it's sort of ironic. And sometimes the pro-life movement will post these memes, and you sent one of me like, they are killing children, But then again, it's like, well, it seems like with contraception, you're just preventing children from forming, versus killing children right before or at like day one of like zygote stage or something like that. Again, natural abortions don't really seem to pose a problem any more than like children dying in because they were breached or something like that, which was fairly common historically. Huge numbers of children probably died, and mothers died in childbirth. So that would just go under the category of natural evil here. Again, just it's more like a hurricane or like an earthquake. Again, you could blame the earthquake because, well, you didn't have good building materials or something like that. There's ways you could humanize the natural evils in the world, but with one positive use, for example, of natural family planning, and see, this is where God, in a sense, if he does exist, is damned if he does and damned if he don't. One positive use of natural family planning is actually, if you're struggling to create children, actually, again, if you look at pastors or psychologists who have to counsel people, or counselors, that's a frustration for many people here. In that instance, if you only have sex when you are fertile, you're trying to create children. You're not doing it, so to speak. You're not successfully doing it here. Now, again, that I would just classify that as natural evil or natural incompetence. Just because you have some disability or some inability, doesn't make that's the general thing. Again, then teleology as a thing is actually false, because not all women are not all men. There's a certain amount of pair bond groups of people that you could pair together that are technically infertile. Again, purposely making yourself infertile seems to be, again, if that's okay, then my next question is, then why not just say abortion's okay? What this reminds me of is the difference between wage slavery and chattel slavery. There's a clear relationship between the two. And Noam Chomsky was asked once about this, and then he brought up the Southern argument for slavery here. We did an episode on wage slavery, and some people were like, that comment on it, like, there's no similarity between this. Well, if you don't have enough choices in jobs because the government or various other entities make it impossible for you to get a job, then in a sense, because you taking a bad job that you otherwise wouldn't have taken in a more ideal circumstances, in a sense, is like slavery here. And then you could reevaluate position on slavery. Well, actually, I mean, then you start saying positive things, and then you get to the Southern argument for slavery here, which is what one of the things Chomsky was making here about with respect to the which is the thing there. So that's in a sense what I'm doing here with this episode here, because as a libertarian, a lot of times the paleo-cons, and this is why I think one of the peripheral reasons I'm doing this is libertarians at times, particularly people like Walter Block, as well as others, get accused of being, child murderers here for being on the fence about abortion. I've always been somewhat on the fence about abortion here, but when someone like Ray Comfort or some of these Protestant evangelicals do really good arguments or propaganda, depending on what you want to say, against the things against abortion, I think, and abortion, yeah, I think, wow, they're making a really good humanistic, persuasive case. I mean, I wouldn't recommend people getting abortions here. And again, if one argument to think it's murder is like ask someone who's relatively well off and they had a quote unquote accident here, in the sense that they, were being a little sloppy here, and they had their fourth child, and there's a little younger here. You ask them, "Are you going to have abortion?" They probably will look at you with a look of horror. They probably will, and I think that's because they know that they could potentially raise you into adulthood. So they in that sense they think it. But my pushback here, and I think the pro-life movement goes this direction if they follow the argument seriously. I just think you're making a distinction without a difference here. You're really obsessing over that little difference, because, if you're in a productive, stable family, what's going to happen. We're not savages. If you're purposely frustrating at things, it just seems like a distinction without much difference here. You could imagine yourself having more children, yet you don't here. Again, it's a radical position, but is it a true position here? Now, you could just turn around and say, well, this position is untenable. But then again, I just think you have to reevaluate other positions if you think that position is untenable, because if you look at the statistics of abortion, it's that might be a disagreement I have. And again, I go back to my libertarianism. Libertarianism is somewhat structurally agnostic on this question here, and that's my question here. So somewhat of this is a defense by offense here. That would be a crass way to describe what I'm trying to do here. So then what are your comments on me here? Again, there's an empirical question over who gets abortions and for what reason. But then there's also an empirical question of who uses contraception and who doesn't and for what reasons. I think that needs to be looked into. If you just view it as intent, preventing children that you don't want to have. So let's say you wanted to have 6 children, but then you got the 7th child. I mean, again, obviously, if you had 5 children, or let's say 6 children, and then you got sextuplets or something like at the end, you wouldn't say, I'll just kill 5 and then keep one of them. I mean, that would be a strange position. But, I think the question of is murder wrong, or the ad hominem episode, you made an interesting joke at the end. And that's well, maybe I should treat my mother like that. Maybe that is the logical way to treat my mother. There's a certain sense in which, people's inconsistency here actually allows people to have children in a way that if you took the argument seriously, they just end up, treating everyone poorly or murdering more people. So I do think there's a kind of idiosyncratic, maybe we shouldn't want people to be consistent here, but I don't know. So then what do you make of this? I
think you're right that not a lot, well, I don't know the proportions, but many people seem to use abortion as a form of contraception, as after conception contraception, as it were, although it's not, or birth control probably is more accurate. I think that's certainly true. The problem, though, going down the line of saying that, it's analogous to murder, is because then you just push it back even further and say anything that, any decision that people make about the surrounding environment which might reduce the population somehow is... sorry, when I say reduce the population, I mean not reduce it, but conditions in which it would make it more difficult to have more children, for instance, is kind of analogous to murder, which seems odd that, because you didn't, suppose you wouldn't sell something that might make a woman more fertile to someone because they couldn't afford the price, that somehow you've murdered the child that doesn't exist. I mean, if you're going down that line, I think you could push back further and further and further, and then basically just say, you got a problem of evil situation. As reiterated said before, there is a clear difference between sperm and egg and the zygote. The zygote has all the DNA required to become a mature human adult. and does not require, and that is built in. It is a separate substance in a way that sperm and eggs aren't. So I think there is a categorical difference there. But I would agree with you that if you have a situation where your goal is to use your sex organs in such a way that you always attempt to not have children, that would be a misuse of them. That would seem to be the case. And I would also say that that's the case with someone engaging in natural family planning. Natural family planning, because their goal is never to have any children, which would clearly be what the sex organs are not directed toward doing, and you're using them contrary to their purpose. As I said, I think you can make a case, insofar as you have children or you intend to have them in a reasonable number, that contraceptive sex isn't contrary to that, because for the reasons I outlined earlier. So I
don't want to dominate the conversations too much here, but I do want to quickly respond to your comment about like the maximalizing, human maximizing claim here. Oftentimes when socialists argue like free healthcare for all, or you have a right to healthcare, Jimmy Dore will make that claim that he has a right to MRI. I think, well, do you have a right? If you look at how you make an MRI, you need like rare earth minerals from Nigeria, I think, or something like that, or Brazil. So like, I think like, well, then you need a Navy to bring them in, and then you need all these other things. Or like, and also in COVID lockdowns, you had the necessary versus unnecessary job distinction here. Like I think like it seems like there might be, you're correct to say then that anything that inhibits human flourishing is a like murder. Okay, but the most concrete example is someone killing a 40-year-old guy in cold blood. Again, not like anything else, not like assassination or political motivated, because if you really ask the assassinator, they're doing it for their good. Someone who assassinated Lincoln, you ask him, well, he was a tyrant and we're killing tyrants. That's actually a good aim. That's not really a negative aim here. But murder, and to use the Whoopi Goldberg thing, like that seems to be the thing here. And like these other things, like when the socialists argue that, like, I mean, that's one reason why I'm not a socialist, for example. Because like I can make an argument that like having good national parks, if you don't have good national parks, my mental health will suffer and I'll kill myself, or I might start killing my neighbors here if you don't have good parks. Now, do I think if you prevent parks from forming or good hiking trails from forming, are you a murderer? Well, I do think you're cutting down human flourishing by doing that. So it could be the case that any act that doesn't promote human flourishing is a kind of murder or murder adjacent thing, but then you just have a distinction of the types. So maybe my position is too extreme here, but then I just say there's a lot of other positions about that are also extreme. I don't want to dominate the conversation too much here, but that's would be my response to that here with respect to this. I mean, for now, the law is, again, as you say, the law is schizophrenic. I totally agree with that. But I would also say lots of things are schizophrenic here, but that shouldn't stop us trying to think of what a clear position or a clear hypothetical position, because the pro-life movement is going to win victories. It's one in certain jurisdictions. I think it's definitely going to win victories. And, as we see with most social movements, they don't go away. I mean, they will go after other things here. Like the suffragists got the right to vote and then they went for alcohol or something like that. The movements aren't going away. And I think contraception, there are people who do think this kind of seemingly extreme position. That'd be my pushback. Is anything that like cuts down human flourishing murder adjacent here? Swethan, what would you say to that?
If you're not going to take the position that an actually existing human is categorically different from a non-existent human, well, then, from giving your position, then we just say, well, the murder is fine. You kill the adult, so what? I mean, it's like killing it's just like preventing the sperm and egg getting together. So, not really much of an issue. So you could go the other way and just say, well, murder's fine. Get on the basis you're going. So to avoid that conclusion, I think, as I say, I'm just applying the criteria that you would use to determine any other biological substance. when is a dog in existence, when is a cat in existence, it'd be basically the same criteria based on the different species or breed. So I don't think my position is hugely radical in that respect. But I would agree, the ethics of contraception and number of children is another interesting one. I mean, just to note, even with the quiverful movements, etc., I don't know if they attempt like genuine fertility maximization, because there might be times where they decide not to have sex, but they could have done, and then could have had a child earlier, which then may have increased the theoretical maximum that they could have had. And insofar as they didn't do that, is that bad? Well, probably not. So I think when you get beyond, so I think there are a few issues here. The one is, when do humans come into existence? Second is the ethics of contraception. And third is, what is sort of like an optimal population, or what is an optimal number of children to attempt for? Because I think they are three distinct topics, but they are related. Especially if you take my argument for the bonding of the parents as the goal of raising the child, that there's an argument that, well, we should have like an optimal number of children as such, and this would be the best for growing the species and also also using the resources well. Although it's interesting, as soon as you ever type in anything on optimal population, you always get the groups of people who want to reduce the world's population, which for economic reasons doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense, because you end up having lots of dependence on people who are productive. So instead of having loads of children dependent on their parents, you have lots of old people depending on the workforce. And even that's true in the absence of a welfare state. Whilst they may not be taking taxation money, I mean, it's not really an ideal situation for your population basically to end up, or your society to reduce in size. Now, with optimal population, if you do look at like historic birth rates, they're a lot higher, but the infant mortality and mortality rate prior to giving birth was a lot higher. So, I mean, you're looking at the estimated fertility rates in the UK from the mid 16th century until the early 18th century. It's between 4 and 5. And you get to the 19th century, it's kind of similar, but the population rockets in the 19th century. Why? Because mortality rates fell. So
Quick interruption here. Wouldn't you argue that is a good thing, though,
yeah,
that the mortality rates fell?
Yeah, I would.
So then, in this recently, mortality rates continue to fall, yet people have just been engaging in lots of non-productive sexual reproduction. Wouldn't you then argue then that's a kind of like a hypothetical tragedy that has happened? Wouldn't you make that claim? Would you make that claim?
I would make the claim that you do up until a point, but not because you've killed somebody because they didn't exist, so you can't kill them, but rather the society is less good than it otherwise would be if the population was higher. Now, I don't necessarily think that it would be best if the average number of children per woman was 20, for instance. I don't think that necessarily follows. I think, given that we have significantly higher levels of kind of scarcity than you would have in, say, the Garden of Eden, for instance, that having, I mean, if whenever you think that was, or taking the evolutionary point, you needed to have lots of conceptions to increase the population, or at least to maintain it over time, because the mortality rate was so high. I mean, if you look at some estimates, and obviously there's not much great data on this, but if you look at the estimates of population in the UK, I mean, it's UK or England, I'm not sure. The population between like 1100 and 1300 prior to the Black Death kind of doubles over 200 years, which I think means effectively like an equivalent today of a birth rate of around, I think it's about 2.7, something like that, to grow at that rate over 300 years. Although it may be higher because it's starting with a lower base. The math gets a little bit complicated. So whilst we've been in a situation previously whereby biology is directing us towards, you've got to keep pumping them out because just in case they die, in the situation where you have better medical technology and standard of living, then that's not necessarily needed. So I think really what's needed is a conception of sort of optimal population. And I say that's even the case, I would say, with the sort of the Catholic position, because if you grant that you could do natural family planning perfectly, well, then you could always have no children. So then the question is, well, how many? Which is an interesting question. I mean, higher population is good for war. Higher population allows greater division of labor. Now, having too high a population can have a strain on the food supply, as Malthus would say. Although apparently I came across something saying that Malthus was actually very opposed to contraception, interestingly. Although I didn't read it in great detail, but I thought that was an interesting aside. So there are definite benefits of the population sort of going up, but then the question is, well, by how quickly do you want it to go up? I think it could well be possible that the optimum number is 6. I mean, I suppose that's possible. I don't know, but I think again, taking like a local information situation, it's going to be down to the individuals in question to go, okay, what is in our interest as a family to flourish as a family, with that, as well as taking into account kind of how this impacts sort of society as a whole. Now, you could say, well, the best thing to do is have no children, which is the position that is sort of currently kind of popular to a large extent. But in a sense, I think that's against your interest. But again, you'll get. I mean, the big thing here then is sort of feminism, amongst other things, and what is a good life. I mean, I suppose that's what you're going to get to as well. But insofar as you take more of a general conception than I would do, then we're going to want a birth rate which is over 2.1. And playing around with some of the numbers, Israel seems pretty decent at 2.8, which would be the case if each woman had 3 children on average, and 95% of women were married, which was the case in like 1940, which probably seems a reasonable thing that would happen if it was the case that out of wedlock birth didn't happen, or if they were very minimal. So I say I think there's 3 issues. There's when do humans come into existence, ethics of contraception, and how many children should you have. I think those are 3 things.
I want to hit what was your first claim? The
3
3 issues?
When do humans come into existence? Second, the ethics of contraception, and then how many children should you have? Which are all 3 related questions.
Well, I will say that with respect to the ethics of contraception here, I mean, there's plenty of people who argue that contraception is a positive good. Again, anyone who uses it, for example, seemingly to argue against it is doing a performative contradiction here. Although you can still hold that thing to be theoretically wrong, yet do it. So then I would just say that, and again, I think it's an empirical question. Then, what do most people who are having abortion intend to do? Well, they're just intending because they don't. Again, there are Satanists and other groups, blood organ harvesters, blah blah blah. I do agree, but a lot of them seem to be like just people who don't have their life in order, and so then you ask, well, they'll make the claim that, well, this child will just be a criminal, or this child will just be raised in a poor environment. And then well, if that argument is true, then like, then what's the difference when you have a Christian couple said, well, after any more than 6 children, I just can't afford to have any more than 6 children because it will cut into my lifestyle I'm having. I just don't see that as much of a difference here. Again, you could try to use sort of reasoning to say, well,
what if that couple was just engaged in natural family planning, which they knew would 100% work? Would your position alter in that case?
No. I mean, again, this is where like autistically being pure in your reasoning will just lead you, to me, the spirit of the law is important here in the sense that like if I drove a car and knew you were going to cross the street, and I could get away with it, that you would purposely step out on the street at this time, and I knew you were going to do that. I knew you every day you would cross the street and you didn't look. I don't know, you were looking at your phone or something like that, and I did it. I knew that knowledge. I would say that, like, because I know that, again, no one else knows my thoughts there, so you can't, this is where the privacy thing comes in. If my intention is to do that, then I more or less merge you. So, like, to me, natural family planning is just like people trying to create spurious reasons to justify their position. Again, if family planning is a good thing, then great, do it. Again, there are arguments against abortion pills for women as well as certain procedures done for men. Like plenty of women seem to have like hormonal problems. Again, I'm not a health expert here, although we don't trust the health experts. But plenty of like the pills women take, they might have negative side effects here. So like there might be actually good arguments for using natural family planning over pharmaceutical family planning and so forth here. I will make that claim here. So the natural family planning to me is just like a spirit of the law versus legal, like law of the law here. Like there's other ways to murder people and get away with it in that sense here.
Do you think there is a categorical difference between a human and a non-human?
What do you mean a non-human?
Well, a non-human would be an animal.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree there's a difference.
Or are the bones of a human actually a human? Or is it just the bones of a human that used to exist? Or is it...
Okay. I mean, I do obviously think there's a difference between a table and a human, or a plane and a human. I do think that's a difference here. Is there a difference between someone in the grave? Not. I don't really think that. Although if you went and robbed my family's graveyard plots, I would view you as morally dodgy here. But then again, I would just make that a proprietarian claim. With respect to but I do think there's a difference between someone's bones and someone's, once they die, the worms, and unless you mummify or something, they'll just sort of decay and fall apart. So I do agree there's a difference here. But I would also just say, well, there's a difference between adult, a 5-year-old child, a 1-year-old child, a fetus, and a potential fetus. And in this sense, I mean, I've done a lot of research into pro-life movement and debates and things like that. And I find when someone like Jeff Durbin stands outside of an abortion clinic and convinces someone not to have an abortion and have their child, that's a heartwarming story. That's great. I mean, if children are good and they're going to have a child, that's a great marketing pitch. I think, if children are good, humans are good. We should laugh at the climate change people who don't want to have children because one more child's gonna be one more rich polluter or something like that. So if you're gonna make the claim that that's a potential life that could have happened that didn't happen. So it just I'm just pushing it. In some way this is a playful argumentation too. But in some sense, it's deadly serious here because I do think that civilization will react. And I think you more or less agree with me on the empirical data. Eventually, we're going to have hit a trough point, and on the other side of the trough point, Like, we're going to be only selecting for hyper fertile people, both culturally as well as genetically. So I do think this argument, although it seems ridiculous for many people now, I don't see what's wrong with saying, like, you could potentially have a bigger family, and if you potentially didn't have that family, you didn't potentially maximize your happiness. I don't like, as far as like, should single people harming the social good. I do think. I mean, I took a trip to Canada, Montreal, and one of the things they said, I took a tour of the cathedral, and they said, like, if families weren't having children every year, they were sort of shamed. Like, and then people talk about shame is bad. Well, like, if I murdered your family, and you and your friends shamed me, didn't want to talk to me, well, that's actually a useful use of shame. Like, so, I mean, again, shame has its uses, in my opinion. So, I mean, I do think that at a certain point, if you're on a deserted island and you have, it's at some point, failing to meet an obligation, if indeed positive obligations do exist, does meet that criteria. And I will say that non-productive sex, I mean, Slavoj Zizek would once provocatively pointed out that, like, marriage is basically a form of prostitution in a certain sense. Like, and again, you get these commentators that actually, in an implicit way, agree with that too. So, like, non-productive sex ends up looking like masturbation too. And we've discussed this with Roger Scruton and others, and Giles Fraser. So I do think there's a lot of issues surrounding it aren't very clear. So again, this is a hypothetical imperative here, in the sense that, like, I think the hypothetical imperative might come real here, or at least you get the inklings of its realness. It's a modern problem because of modern technology here. If children are just dying because, for natural reasons here, then that's sort of like an easy way out. But, like, if you ask a mother whose child who just died because they died in, of whatever, some infant disease, you wouldn't say, oh, well, in order to get 6, you have to let 10 die. I mean, wouldn't it be better, So then you have to ask the question, what's the difference between if you have to have 18 attempts to get 6 children versus having just 6 for 6? Like, what is the optimal thing here? So that'd be my, like, final comment. We're starting to approach the hour mark. I don't want to make this too extended unless you have more comments here. I do think there's a relationship between the two. And I would just argue it's an arbitrary. I would just argue it's an arbitrary distinction. Like, when does life begin? I don't know. I mean, I do think an adult human who's fully educated or fully has a trade or some sort of skill, like, I mean, I think that, like, the Randians will get attacked. Like, for example, the Randians, like, you put all your time into helping a handicapped, or whatever politically correct term you want, child, versus putting the same amount of time into 5 children who are going to become engineers, doctors, piano makers, musicians. Like, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, in a super abundant society, we should do both. But to go back to scarcity, we can't always choose both. Sometimes you have to make choice A or choice B, unless you want to just say, well, miraculous things can happen. But if miraculous things can happen, then why not just go for the 25 norm of the thing? So we do have to make, like I'd say, Faustian decisions here. But I would say that the ethics of birth control and contraception are dodgy. And, like, I just would just push to apply them consistently. I remain a libertarian. And fortunately, society, for better or for worse, many areas think birth control is fine, and many areas think abortion is fine. Again, I anytime, like, I mean, I think it's great when people go out to those clinics and, tell people not to do it. But then to me, the next question is if you could have more children, why aren't you having more children? And I mean, you're honest. I will say something. You're honest enough in our "Why Do People Have Children" episode to recognize the implicit claim in there. Like, I have 0 children. I currently don't desire to have any children. But then again, that's sort of economic reasons. And to go back to the shame point, like, I do, in some sense, like, feel, like my grandmother, when, was sort of like, before she died, was, I was sort of annoyed that I wasn't married or actively searching to get married. Like, so like, is that shame? Is that quote unquote annoyanceness? Sure. Well, she could have had more children, and then she'd have more attempts. She had more room for screw ups. I mean, that's one feature of having children. Like Tyler Cowen made the comment in an interview that like had an Italian intellectual, and he said that the 2-person Italian family doesn't work because you need to have like at least 6 children because one of them was going to always screw up. So, or at least half of them are going to screw up. So that's my claim. I think we should reevaluate large family norms. That would be my claim. I don't really have any more comments here. If you want to have more comments, please do. I do think this is an interesting topic as well. So even if it's crazy.
Do you think your position would change if you could definitively say when a human begins and when it doesn't?
Do you think I would change if definitively? Well, I would just say that. I mean, Edmund Burke, I think, has the claim that society is a compact between the living, the unborn, and the dead here, and the dead vote by tradition. I think that's G.K. Chesterton's claim. So like, I would say that like, someone like Thomas Aquinas or Plato or whomever still sort of a sense exists in idea form. So like, when people ask like, when does a person begin? Like, I do think like a 1-year-old child, in some sense, who doesn't know language. If you lock a 1-year-old child and they don't form language, they're in some sense, again, this sounds barbaric, but if you're being clear about it, there is some sense a handicapped person is, like you wouldn't want to marry a handicapped person. You would like not like handicapped like they can't walk, but like as in like they can't have a conversation. Like it would be pointless to have this conversation with an actual person with Asperger's or some disease. Like, would you agree?
Well, yes.
It would be,
yeah. But the question then is, but are they human?
I don't know.
I mean, they're clearly not. No. So, irrespective of whether you know they are or not, if you had a clear conception of this is human, this is not human, would your position on the dodginess of contraception and it being sort of equivalent to murder, would you think that would your fears would be allayed if you could go human, not human, with a categorical, at least metaphysically different, even though epistemologically it might be difficult to tell?
I think it'd be epistemologically difficult to tell.
No. Even if it was, metaphysically, suppose in principle you could recognize the distinction between human and non-human, would it change your position?
I don't know what the objection is seeking to. The question is seeking to.
It seems to me that because you're agnostic and when a human being exists, it's why you can extend it into the past prior to their actual existence, and this is how you can make the claim that contraception is analogously murder. So my claim is, well, hang on. I think I have a very simple response to this. I go categorically, that's human. This is the reason why, which I think is a non-arbitrary point. So I can go, well, murder, not murder. And the situation is very different because we actually have a human in existence, which has natural rights, etc., and things. And so therefore needs to be respected as an individual human. But if the human doesn't exist, well, there's no human to respect. So if you can have a categorical difference, would it make a difference on your position?
Probably not.
Why not?
I've yet to see a categorical difference be made here. I would just.
I said human. The zygote has a DNA structure which is directed towards becoming an adult human, which is different than sperm and egg, which are not an individual substance in the same sense and the same directions towards a human. You have to have this external fact, and only once you have the first DNA structure do you have a separate being. And they say this is true of all biological items.
When the two things combine, at that point,
yes,
it becomes.
Even if you thought that was false, supposing my position was true that it does, would it change your position?
I have no idea. I would say it's like the difference between the ball. Like you have the two things on top of a hill. At down there, the two things are going to crash into each other. That's the zygote. That's the sperm and the egg. I'm just looking at the top of the hill. You're looking at the bottom of the hill when they form. Like if someone built a dam up there to prevent them to be forming, versus someone, um, um, like they do form and then like kill them like on day 30. I just think that if you look backward into time, it's the same. It's a similar enough thing here. And then the reason I keep going on about when does a person form is, like the secular thinkers can't really come up with a clear answer here. So one extreme position to say, well, it begins. You look back into time, but when people, like, do you think a person like when would you? Of course, you think a person begins when the zygote, when the sperm and egg meet. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's clear. There's clearly different human biological substance at that point. Yes.
Okay, so if you like again, you also agree that with respect to knowledge here, like if humans are rational creatures, we're not doing this out of instinct might play some role in it, but like you do agree that like we're not like we seem to know how the process works. Again, like as a kid, funny enough, as a quick aside, I didn't being from a moderately good Christian household. I don't mean to diss my parents here or anything like that. I didn't know how children was formed. I thought like, no, I'm not joking about this, sounds embarrassing, but I thought like creation happened because if parents loved each other, God would interject the child into the womb. That's really like, I can't remember my thoughts when I was like 9 or 8, but that's how I thought children were formed. That sounds embarrassing, but it's actually quaint in a sense. I'm probably not the only one who thinks analogous thoughts like that. So like I just think like if you're preventing something from forming versus like I just think you're putting too much into the formation date here. There is a pre-work to create the fertile ground, which people are purposely sabotaging. Again, I'm fine with the sabotaging of it. I just would say, well, you have to be more consistent across the board. Now, I guess the only way out.
But would you say then that is being single and being celibate sabotaging?
Well, I would say as a particular distinction within the Christian context, it seems like two of the more important people are single, Paul and Christ. Again, you can get into historical debates whether they are certain people are or not. I don't, but like society, like as I said with shame, society does, and I'd say this is correct shame if you're being consistent. Like if you're ceasing to have children, like in some sense, unless you're like a monk in a monastery or it's like something like that, or doing some great work, you are in some sense, if children are a virtue and so forth, then I would say you are failing to meet some obligation. That would be my logical argument here in social terms here. And the pro-life movement, like people like Doug Wilson, will make that claim here. There's plenty of people who will make that claim here that people are better off with children than without children. Now, again, this could be selection effects too. So I see your argument that there's a sort of like there is a hard cutoff date here, but sort of like I just want to push it. I sort of want to push it back on the you're putting a lot of emphasis in the formation date here, and I think the pre-formation, the planning stage to get to that formation seems to matter too. Would you agree?
I don't say it's irrelevant, but I think it's categorically different. And as I stated before, one of the purposes isn't just sort of a unitive sort of psychological fulfilling the parent's position, but it's sexual activity is a way of binding them together on sort of like a biological way, using sort of hormonal, so that the child is cared for in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So I think that yes, it's true that the sex organs are directed towards procreation, but also the raising of the child as well.
My answer would be this: if there was an Incapistan, Tim Patanistan in Incapistan, and I had to set up again. Our laws created or discovered. I would have two positions: either contraception and abortion are fine, or contraception and abortion is not fine. That would be my kind of reasoning here. So, like, if one's fine, the other's fine. And as far as the other things
Was
about
natural
cutting
family
down
planning
humans,
defined?
yeah, no. Well, see, yeah, this goes back to the privacy claim about you can't know every. I mean, it's fine enough, but like, it's not. Again, it goes back to like, how do you actually make something illegal, in the Capistan here? I just, like Hans Hoppe, when asked about these questions, would just say it's a local issue, which I like. In this sense, I do think it's a local issue. It's a very local issue here, but then I would just say many of these things are, like that also makes the banning of abortion also a kind of like, like, I the banning of abortion is a thing that's happened, which is fine. Again, I don't screech when that happens. I mean, I think if anything, it's good. But I would also counterintuitively, I would say, think that if some regime banned contraception, that would also be, if children indeed are good, and there isn't a really hard limit on how many children society or the globe can hold. I mean, then why not? That'd be my position. If like, what would your position be in a stateless society if you were tasked? I mean, you can't. If you were tasked with creating the quote unquote laws in a stateless society, like what you would just put it at the zygote. Anything after the zygote forming then
Yeah.
becomes a communal issue, and laws prescribed to that. Again,
Yeah.
I think that's fair enough. I don't think it's inconsistent if you want to say that's a hard formation date there. But if it, I don't think that, like, for failing to give blood or failing to give kidney is murder either. But you could think that. I mean, if for example your son needed a kidney, okay, and you're the only match, and you said no thanks, and the group shamed you, would you think their shame is correct?
Yeah, I mean, this shame could be good. I mean, it's what you're shamed in doing. No objection to shame in principle. Um, I think that as I've tried to make clear, my position is that human and non-human, and once it exists, you need to treat them in a particular way. But it doesn't follow from that we need to have fertility maximization, which clearly is the implication of your position. Which I just don't think follows. Um, and as I say, I think you need a discussion of optimal population, really.
Yeah, I would say that you need a discussion of optimal population, but I would say that the that's a hard discussion to have, from like that just becomes like a local question. Uh, that becomes somewhat a local question too. Like how many children do you want? Do you think it'd be better off if more people had children? Like as far as you could tell, do you think people be better off if everyone had if all people had zero children, had one child, and all people have one extra? Like, I'm gonna make
I would
this
say
is like a what?
any married couple or common law couple, male and female, would be better if they had children. If they didn't, yes, but not if they were single, because there's no obligation
Do you
in
think?
that case.
Do you agree with the Joseph Cato, and other line, the Freakonomics line? You talk about natural family and it's a tent. Um, I mean, to me, when I look at the, do you agree that the intent? Do you agree that's mostly just failure to use birth control? Most abortions are just failure to use birth control.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that?
yeah. I mean, I don't think most of them go out of the way to have children and then kill them. I don't. That's possible, but no. I mean, they're just,
Oh yeah, there's certain circumstances where that clearly does happen.
yeah, that does
I
happen.
do.
I mean, some of them do, but I mean, in most cases, that seems unlikely. It's just, oh, went wrong, didn't it? Oh, I bought it. So yeah, no, I agree. That certainly seems to be the major motivator. Yes.
Do you think utilitarians should be more increased? Do you think a utilitarian should be more about increasing the existence number of humans? Like, if humans' existence is good, you think utilitarians should be more fetal maybe not maximalizes, but not fetal human
Yes,
reducers.
I would say so, more so, yeah. I mean, it's a greater good for greatest number, but more children on average selling in the West today is kind of important. I mean, just on an obvious one. I mean, in the absence of very low birth rates, the probability that you're going to get now, the question arises: what came first? Nevertheless, you're unlikely to get the high level of immigration that you do get, which is clearly destabilizing for various reasons. Now, you could say that's a good thing, but I mean, it does seem to be the case that it's going to alter ways of life and historic ways of living and the cohesion of such cultures. And, as Robert Putnam has pointed out, increase in social um, distrust and things, that you're going to want a high enough population growth such that you at least don't need significant immigration. I mean, some immigration here and there was probably fine, but if you've got massive amounts such that it sort of it would be kind of analogous to sort of like adopting like 20 children when you've got 3 of your own biological ones. It's probably not good.
I would say people's one of the people I think that might occasionally listen to the show like would make the claim that like uh I I don't really want to get into it too much because it's probably too much of the next step here. But like your distinction, I think, lies on the. I don't want to start a new topic here, but I think your distinction lies on the date that's formed, and I would just say that's kind of like it's kind of like an arbitrary date. Now you're going to say it's non-arbitrary, but then how does this decision, this disagreement get
We
resolved
need a
here? I mean, one
generalized view of what things are, what natural objects, if natural objects exist, and say, in general, in the world around us, when we're trying to understand what exists and what doesn't exist, what is one thing and what is not something else. So I suppose it's a problem of, in a way, the one and the many, because you could just say everything is different. There's no sort of commonality, or everything is just one, and you can go to like the panenthean sort of position. So I think you need a prior discussion of how do we know one thing is one thing and it's not something else, and it is different on a non-arbitrary level. I think that's
fair
kind of
enough.
where you need to go.
I would just say that if there was then just a category distinction between you could just like I said I had said you could reevaluate your position on abortion, reevaluate your position on murder, reevaluate your position on contraception, or reevaluate your position on words. I mean, I would just say in this sense that although I think it's rhetorically useful, uh, there is the kind of the question of like what's in that woman's stomach question. Like I do think is is a kind of the question in itself, and then like how did that thing in the stomach or person in the stomach get there? We know how he got there, or at least we to as much as we can understand causality, we know how we create it. So then the question is like like if you know how to cause something and you don't cause it, like I I think there's a relationship there. You don't interestingly think there's as much you think they're related, but you think there's a hard starting point of the project, and that's right there. I would just say that like the pre stuff is there. I do think. Do you think that it's logical that that there's a potential reactionary to the current society? Like if you look at Handmaid's Tale, there was a Christian guy who read it, and he actually I never read the book, but he said that like it's actually because no one could have children, so they need to increase. They had like zero, like point negative, like that's what the fictional side. Like there is going to be a reaction if like again, I personally think the third world and the second world will have low birth rates eventually too. I don't think they're going to keep their high. Like I think they're going to assimilate for those things too. Um, that's my personal view on it. So like, do you think there's going to be a reaction to this? And do you think this kind of seemingly extreme position might be the reaction against it? So then,
Possibly. I think certainly the problems of um, a low birth rate, the low replacement rate is going to become obvious. And I think when people kind of realize that's kind of a problem, and they realize, okay, there might be a solution to this other than importing people from overseas, from different cultures who have little in common with us, then we might need to realize that we have to increase our own birth rate. I think that's possibly true. Whether you get into the situation of basically white Sharia is another question. But yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. But I would say, yeah.
So one final question: if you, so let's say someone blew up let's say no investor would invest any money in any contraception company, okay, or almost nobody, and that would drive the price of contraceptions up really high, or at least high enough. And Margaret Sanger Inc. wouldn't do it. Like, would you? You just made the price of contraception, like, let's say they just, anything that, now you could argue that this hypothetical example could happen because the latex to make, condoms or things like that is just, but would that be, like, there are certain ways roundabout, like some sort of like the Quakers who pioneered this scenario against slavery. They just ceased to do any business with them. And actually some groups have copied this strategy here. Like in Japan, for example, more money is spent on adult diapers than child diapers. So I just think that like, far from, there are things abrew here. Like, this sounds extreme, but there are things like I don't think they're as crazy as like some of the feminists think they are. But like, I do think there are things ahead that could happen here. I just think it's logically at least somewhat related. Or else you just need to reevaluate your positions on words too. Maybe there is the difference between killing. Maybe Peter Singer is correct that there is a difference in potentiality between killing a young child and killing a completed adult. Now, I mean, if a 90-year-old who's had a nice life decides not to get cancer treatment, I mean, that's on the other end of the spectrum here. I mean, some Christians and some ethicists think that's kind of like suicide adjacent. I don't think it's suicide adjacent, interestingly enough, because they've already had a productive, seemingly I don't think the Canadian government should recommend, although it probably does save them some money. So if you think that's the case, if two people were drowning in the river, my 6-year-old nephew and a 99-year-old grandmother, I'd probably take unless I thought if the 6-year-old was obviously going to drown, I would pick the 6-year-old. Again, you say that's a lifeboat scenario, like falling on things, but then sometimes you have to make the kind of like hard-nosed choices here. I would just push the date back into that. Failing to create the young child's also problematic too. So again, the law is, in the Carl Schmitt sense, you'd say the law is schizophrenic, but the law is currently perfectly fine with all the things we mentioned. If anything, it's current existing, and I think this is called, Hegel would call the owl Minerva only flies. If anything, contraceptions, far from being banned, are free, or more than, they're like free, like in the sense that your tax dollars pay for other people's abortions and procedures here too. So like, far from being like, so the current existing order is very contraception friendly. I think you'd obviously agree with that claim. But yeah, that'd be I enjoyed having the conversation. So I hope it's not too much of a crazy position.
No, crazy positions are entertaining. That's absolutely fine. Just now, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more people we get in subscribers, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.